Hello, and welcome to the Pink Pineapple Podcast, where we peel back femtech and take a bite out of more than just the juicy bits.
I'm Claudia, and I'm Emma's partner in Pineapple for this adventure.
And I'm Emma. Together, we're exploring women's health across the full timeline, from first periods to menopause and everything in between.
Each week, we'll dive into the stories, science, and software shaping the future of women's health. From hormones to hardware, fertility to femtech founders.
Think of us as your slightly nosy best friends who just happen to be doctors with a healthy curiosity for innovation.
We'll be chatting to clinicians, creators, and change makers. And yes, asking the questions you actually want answered.
So whether you're out for a walk, cooking dinner, or hiding from your to-do list, join us as we get curious, clinical, and occasionally controversial.
This is the Pink Pineapple Podcast,
where women's health meets what's next. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Pink Pineapple Podcast. And today we have Michelle Griffin with us from MFG Health. Welcome, Michelle.
Hi there. Thanks so much for having me on.
Claudia.
As usual.
We saw some sellotape a little while ago. Michelle and I are a little concerned. Who have you got with you?
Do not. I've learnt something today. You know, every day's a school day. I've learnt that sellotape does not stick to pineapples, evidently. So here we go. I'm going to do my best to hold it on because sellotape does not stick to pineapples. But this is our attempt at a pineapple today. These are little fibroids. We've got a pineapple with little fibroids stuck to it.
I love that. I love that.
Sort of stuck to it because
I feel like you could get a bit of Play-Doh and kind of made a 3D model on a cocktail stick. Like I'm really getting into how
Michelle,
to jazz up the pineapple now.
I could have. You're just showing me up now, to be fair.
This is why Michelle is, MFG Health, her expertise. This is why she's in consultancy, Claudia.
This is exactly the sort of skills that I bring to women's healthcare. Definitely. Play-Doh and a cocktail stick. What can't be solved with those?
So in all seriousness, Michelle, you have had a very distinguished career in obstetrics and gynecology and within the NHS. You are now working as a health tech consultant and advisor. What prompted that transition to move into this industry?
Well, that's a good question. Everybody asks me that in these situations. And I always feel that I'd love to be able to say, well, I had this great grand plan and everything was really mapped out. But I keep it real and say nothing was mapped out at all. And it was just kind of moving the next step when the time was ready to move to the next step. And I think the thing that really, when I look back and really kind of assess what I was thinking when I was doing clinical medicine and seeing patients, is that I absolutely loved it. I really loved seeing patients. I really loved having the interaction. I absolutely loved surgery as well. So I loved being able to treat people surgically and see the impact and make a difference. And I think that's basically what all doctors say, but it's true. But what struck me after the years of doing that is that whilst I loved doing that on a one-to-one basis and doing that for the individual women that I was seeing and treating, just kind of something grew more and more in me to make me think, I want to have more of an impact. And something that came up time and time again was that even though for that individual woman, it was very heartfelt, it was very difficult for her, it was the same problem. And I thought there's got to be a better, more efficient way to try and have an impact in healthcare that scales to reach a lot more women, but actually has more of an impact so that where I see women in the 2000s and 2010, we don't want to see them again in 2020 or the new younger version of them, let's say, who then hit that problem and then say, I don't know what to do about this. Or that problem's still a problem and we're still treating it in the same way. So I think that's probably what always sat inside, and then it just grew and grew and grew. And I didn't know how to go about trying to do that, but I went around things in a really lovely meandering way of picking up lots of different jobs, lots of different experiences along the way. And, really it was, my career so far is in two parts. It's very clinical. I did a lot of work specializing in obstetrics and gynecology. I saw many, many patients. and had some amazing experiences. But then I moved out first as a sabbatical to Public Health England, but ended up staying there working on big strategic women's health projects across the UK, and then moved over to World Health Organization, doing more international strategic women's health projects. And a big thing there is I recognized the need for tech, definitely in other countries in the world. And I realized that that was a massive gap in my understanding. I didn't really have any experience, and I thought I needed to do something for that. So I then moved out into working in med tech, working for a couple of startups as chief medical officer, and loved that, loved the speed of it and loved the decision making. And it really reflected what I was doing clinically, but I got to use that and apply it in a different way. And that's where I really saw that there was a big hole in kind of that clinical commercial expertise in women's health startups. And so hence that's where MFG Health was born, really, and have continued to grow that over the last few years, helping companies really be the best clinical and commercial success that they can be.
Yeah, I love that. I understand and feel so much of what you've said, because I say very similar things actually about my own journey into health
Mm.
tech. And also, Michelle, throw in a book as well. My understanding is that you're now writing a book about fibroids. Is that right? So you've done all of this, and then we may as well, why not throw a book in?
Yeah. Now, anybody who really knows me will know that that is a big surprise. That was not on my bingo card for any time at all. But I just, just going back a step, I'd worked with this amazing guy, Charles Yeo, who's in Cambridge, and he's really into obesity. And I always found obesity quite fascinating. And when I was back at university, him and his team, we had some lectures from them, and I absolutely loved them. He brings it to life. And his big thing way back when, years and years ago, was that we shouldn't have so much stigma because there's a big genetic element to obesity. And it was really back at the time that no one believed this in the public. And now we're starting to see the change. But I recently caught up with him and I said, look, you've really been able to bring a big taboo subject out into the open. And he does a lot of work in the public space. And I said, this is where I really feel women's health needs to be. And I think we see similarities with mental health as well. And, 10, 20 years ago, people weren't talking about their mental health. And now, thankfully, it's changed. But I feel that, we're still quite behind in women's health. And so I was like, how do we bring this more into the forefront? And he said, essentially, you've got to write. It doesn't matter what you write, but you've got to write it down. And as clinicians, you've got to fill the vacuum where there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of misunderstanding, and there's just a lot of completely wrong data and information out there that's being spread. So, I thought, okay, I need to do that. And so it started as kind of writing little pieces in the general news. Then I got a BBC women's health column, which was great, to talk about new tech, new innovations in women's health, and try and start to make it that much more attractive, because the healthcare of women is massively attractive. And there's a lot of things for why it is, but you know, for this for the sake of speed now, it is massively attractive. But that was then when Penguin approached me and said, look, we love what you're writing in these articles, but we need to make it more accessible. And I loved that. And I was like, well, that's great. How can I do that? Can we do that together in some way? And so the plan was to launch this women's health series that is launching later this year. And there will be lots of very easy to understand. This is not for healthcare physicians. This is not for professionals. It's not a textbook. It is for every single woman, no matter what background, whether you've got a science background or not. It's for every single woman who's wondering, what is going on with their body. That's what the Women's Health series is about. My specific book is focusing in on fibroids, and I've really written it in a way that if I had infinite amount of time with a woman in front of me in a consultation clinic, this is everything I'd love to tell her. Now, that's turned into quite a lot of pages. Thankfully, she hasn't got to read it all in one. Just have me keep talking to her. But basically, it's a real useful guide for her so that she doesn't feel so like overwhelmed and confused as to what on earth she's being told or what she reads online and what she thinks is going on. And she gets like clear facts and, importantly, explanation behind those facts. what does that mean for her? How is that going to show up for her? How is that going to shape the decisions she now makes with regard to her health?
I think that's fantastic. What an exciting project to be part of, to be part of a series of books. I think that there'll be a lot of demand, and I think they'll be very popular. Like you say, I think with time limited appointments, you can't kind of fully go into the nitty gritty of every diagnosis, can you? So there's certainly a place for these in the current system as it stands. Fibroids do affect so many women, but they seem to be something that's still kind of under discussed, poorly understood, kind of almost a bit sometimes, I don't know, kind of swept under the carpet in some situations. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, so just to take a step back, I mean, the latest data shows that fibroids are present in, by the time you reach the age of 50, fibroids are present in over 70% of women. So if you look at any group of your friends, most of the women in their 40s and 50s will be growing or already have a fibroid. So I'm about to turn 44 and I look at my friendship group and I think most of us have fibroids. Now, some of them will not know they've got them. Some of them will know they've got them, but don't realize it links to the symptoms and the issues that they're facing. And some of them will know they've got them and know clearly it links to the issues that they're facing. And I think this variety in understanding and knowledge is key to why we see so much, why you say as it's so under discussed. I think there is a feeling that is just part of being a woman. It's just accepted, it's expected. And because some people can have them as what we would call incidental findings, so you just pick them up on a scan and the woman says, no, I didn't realize I had them, I don't have any symptoms, then it's like, oh, that would therefore apply to every single woman who's got fibroids, which of course is not the case. But I think in my book, I discuss this a bit, that probably, as we know in women's health across the board, there's so much underreporting. And that's because of this normalization, this expectancy of, well, it's just part of being a woman, or that happens as I get older, or that happens when I've had a baby. And that's not just to do with fibroids, but it's also, when I've had a baby, then maybe I'll start leaking urine because that's just what happens. Or maybe that's what I saw happened with my mum, or my friends have talked about that. And we just expect that to be normal and we'd wear a pad and things would go on from that, rather than just really delving and going, hold up, that shouldn't be expected. That, just because it's common, and I say this a lot, just because something is common doesn't make it normal. And I think the whole population needs to take that on board, not just women, but their families and friends, but mainly the medical community. Just because you see this in a lot of women coming into your GP surgery doesn't mean that that's absolutely fine and we just expect it and we don't need to do anything about it. So I think there is a massive underreporting. And I think if you say to women, do you have any, oh, we found this fibroid on your ultrasound, or we were scanning you for some other reason. Do you have any symptoms of fibroids? Does it bother you at all? I would say the majority of women would say no, but that's because they don't know the whole menu of symptoms that you can get with fibroids. And if you actually went, talk to me, rather than asking that, say, tell me about your periods. Tell me about how heavy they are, how often you bleed, if you pass clots or not, do you leak through, do you need to wear double protection of period products? Um, Tell me about having sex. Is that difficult? Do you get very constipated? Do you find it difficult to keep your bowel motion regular? If we start to really look at these things and ask these questions, this is what women could actually start to answer and say yes, no, accordingly. And then if they really do say no to everything, then you can be sure that they don't have any symptoms related to their fibroids. But it's like saying, if, I went to a mechanic and I know absolutely nothing about cars, and someone said, oh, your XY said blah, blah, blah isn't working. Did you notice that? I'd be like, no, but I don't know what noticing that would look like. So how would I have a clue? So I think we have to appreciate how little understanding there is because the knowledge was never put there. I look at my daughters now, they're 11 and 13. They're not learning about this. So when will we ever learn about it? I didn't learn about this until I became a gynecologist. So, and I'm a woman. So how would I know if I wasn't a gynecologist? Like, that's the simple facts here.
Yeah, you're right. I've got a bee in my bonnet about this, as Emma knows. I always say the same thing. We learn about Henry VIII's wives, but we don't know the difference between paracetamol and ibuprofen, for example, like basic things. What actually is a fever? When do you really need to see a doctor? So yeah, I completely
Definitely.
agree with you.
I was just going to say, I think there's a lot of missing in the education system. And I think it's not only education from school. I just think it's like societal education, like the way that we talk about things. I was just, when we talk about anything within the health and well-being of women, there's so many problems. And this podcast isn't going to go into all of that, but I just think about there is a big thing about acceptance that if something's happening to you, we just accept that rather than saying there's something that can be done about that. And I'm really taken aback, but I'm not surprised, but living through it with my 13-year-old and seeing her friends and as they start their periods. And I say to my daughter, you know, does anybody go out of class? Like, I remember going out of class for like a half a day to get medication to be pain relief for period cramps. And I said, does that still happen? Out of interest, 20, 30 years on. And she said, yeah, every single day. She doesn't get through a single day where there isn't a class where one girl leaves. Like, we talk about kids not being absent from school and we talk about this national thing, and I totally get it, but we're not actually talking about specifically what's affecting girls to such a disproportionate amount. And I'm like, I can say to my daughter, okay, let's look at like your period cramps. You will get them, but we're going to manage them. I can't stop them completely, but I can reduce the pain so that you can continue with work. That's something I can do with you. But again, I can do that because not only am I a doctor, but I'm a gynecologist and I can understand what's going on. But I would say, of all my friends who are doctors, are they doing that with their daughters? No, because they're different types of doctors. So, and that's within the medical community. So it does really start to give you some very clear things about when you see your daughter, and she might go to school, but how much of those classes is she missing? Or how much is she sitting in class in pain and not being able to concentrate? And I think it's really interesting that as people start to approach their kind of national exams, in the UK, like GCSEs, we talk so much about, oh, I've got to make sure that my child is fit and ready. I had a friend who was talking about her son who had recurrent nosebleeds, and she was really worried about that. And I think, wow, we're talking about that, but we're not talking about something that pretty much is happening to almost every 16-year-old girl throughout a 2-month period of doing GCSEs. They will have a period. They'll have ovulatory pain, they'll have period cramps, they will have difficulties with bowel movement, they need to wee a lot perhaps, passing clots, the whole menu of things. But we don't talk about it.
Yeah,
We just
yeah.
expect them to go to school and do their exams.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. We normalize. We say, oh, of course it's going to be painful. Of course you're going to bleed heavy. It's fine on the one hand. And at the same time, we say, but don't talk about it. It's embarrassing. Hide that tampon in your sleeve. Hide this, hide that. Yeah, it's terrible, isn't it? It's really bad. I like to think it's getting better than it was. But again, I also was speaking to my daughter. She's 12, soon to turn 13, and I was asking her, what's the education like in school about periods at the moment? And it's still just as embarrassing and awkward and sparse, to be honest, as it was when I learned. So we really need to do quite a shake up there. Michelle, if you ever want to do
Definitely.
anything, I'm coming with you. We're going to number 10. We're going to
Oh,
number 10 together
definitely.
over this. I'm there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Unfortunately,
it's
it hasn't got any better because there was in the last 12 months a study that did show exactly what Michelle was saying, that, young girls are getting pain, heavy periods. It's having an impact on school attendance. It's having an impact on attainment as well, obviously,
mm,
indirectly, through all these
Mm,
absences. So things aren't any better.
no.
And I think as well, like you were saying, Michelle, as well, sometimes I think there is a thing where, like, if you're taking a history, if you just go, "A period's okay," yeah, okay,
Yeah.
move on. That's not a menstrual history.
Yeah.
Like, that's
No.
just, it's a
No.
pointless question.
Exactly, because you've got to take that child who's been to school where that's been the situation. As we say, there's a problem there. And then, I think the worst thing when we think about in this age of information and accessibility is that if people who know better or have the information and have the skills don't speak up, then there becomes a vacuum because something has to fill that vacuum. So if the child doesn't understand what's going on and there isn't like, hey, we're just doing a check. Does anybody need some extra time to go to the toilet to change period products or underwear or anything like that? We're not going to give you the 5 minutes between your lessons. We're going to give you longer. Just let us know or just do it routinely so you don't actually have to put your hand up and say, this is what's going on. I mean, I'm not a person who's great on the kind of what should be happening in school, but I'm just giving you an example of this is the kind of thing where we need to be heading towards. But if that isn't happening, then that child goes home and all they see is the women in their family and their friends. Now, we know that fibroids has a very large genetic component. So you're a daughter, my daughter will grow up looking at me and how are my periods and how long do I bleed for? And am I in bed several days in a month because my bleeding so heavy? Will I look obviously very pale as I'm bleeding so heavy and becoming anemic? Will I maybe go into hospital and have a blood transfusion? All these things. And that will become, because as a kid, unless you point it out and say, this is not okay, this is not normal, that becomes what we grow up with, becomes our level of normality. So then that kid grows up having seen what their mum went through. They experience similar. They think that that's normal because that's what mum did, that's what my sister did, that's what my aunt did. And then they move forward and they go to their GP. Maybe they pluck up courage. They think, oh, I really, I've got a problem with work. There's usually a pressure point that puts them there. I've missed too many days at work, or my relationship with my partner is suffering. My partner's convinced me I should do something about it. So they go to their GP and then the GP say, are your periods okay? And they're like, well, yeah, because compared to my mum and my sister and the fact that nothing was ever talked about at school and I don't really know what normal is, this is normal. So, yeah. And then the doctor says, right, well, we don't need to do anything. And then they say, I feel, to an extent, nothing's improved and doctors can't help me. And to some extent, they have been dismissed by the system. But to me, that's a communication issue and understanding what normal is. And so obviously that's part of my hope with where the book can come in, but I think it needs to be obviously much, much bigger than that. But this is where I really want to raise awareness of, when I first started work as an obstetrician-gynaecologist, that was many, many years ago. We all lived by the kind of doctrine that heavy menstrual bleeding is greater than 80 mils of blood. And as a young doctor, I just went, oh, okay, cool, fine.
Mhm.
And off I'd go and I'd see women in A&E and I see women in early pregnancy unit and I see women on the gynae ward. I'd see women everywhere. And I'd be like, so do you think you've lost greater than 80 milliliters of blood? I talk about this in my book because I reflect on how stupid that is.
Yeah.
But when
BS.
you're a 24-year-old junior doctor and all you've known is medical school, and medical school told you this is what you ask, this is what you do, and you go on the ward, and this is what the senior doctors tell you to do, you're like,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
But then your brain starts to click in and you're like,
Yeah.
hold up, I'm on my period. And I don't even know, as the gynecologist, how much blood I've
Yeah.
lost. And I'm
Yeah.
asking somebody at A&E, this is ridiculous. And then we'd start by, saying things like, you're passing clots, so lumps of blood. Can you tell me the size of those lumps according to like money pieces? 50
American
pp?
money, a dime, very often. A dime, bit less than a dime. You're like, what is a dime?
Yeah, it's like absolutely. And I feel embarrassed and ashamed because we should never have been doing this. Thankfully, though, we've learned, we've moved on, and now we need to really publicize that heavy menstrual bleeding is if you bleed to a point that affects your life. That's it. It just affects your life, And I think if that means that you have to do whatever you have to do. That will be different for different people because everybody lives a different life. But who am I as a doctor to say that if you're bleeding and it's affecting your life so that you can't do what you want to do, it's not for me to say, well, I think it does or doesn't warrant treatment. Who am I to say that? You tell me, which is why I just want to, when I say about raising awareness and increasing knowledge, it's not becoming a doctor or thinking. There's a lot of pressure on women now to be like, I have to have so much information. I have to know more than the doctor knows before I go and see a doctor. That's not what we're saying. What I'm saying is just understand, is this bothering you, and be able to communicate and tell us how it bothers you. And it might be that you can just say it from your own experience. You might need to record it, like literally write it on a back of an envelope and come in and say, this is what the last month has looked like for me. You may need to bring a friend or a partner with you to say, this is what she does. And when she's bleeding, she's just not with it. She's like laid out on a bed. She's really like affected. She can't do her normal thing. That's not something bad. That's telling the truth. And now I can interpret that and go, that's not okay. Of course, that's not okay. We need to do something for you.
Yeah, I
And that's
totally
what we need
agree.
to understand.
Where do you see tech feature in all this? Because I'm thinking you've gone a bit retro with your book. You've gone old school. I'm making a book and it's there and you've got it on your bedside and you're reading it. Where do you see tech able to help in this?
Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I think, in my short-term ideal world, I would really, I think that we've already done a lot in health tech about trying to educate, kind of be the bridge to provide education through content, through personalized content that's relevant to somebody at that time. Link that to tracking their problems and saying, oh, you're doing this, and giving some information. And I think that has moved the dial slightly, but I don't think that's probably the vehicle that does it. I think tech is really great, actually, about understanding what kind of fibroid you have, what treatment you should then have, and who should have what treatment and what should they expect. Because actually, if you can get to a place, which I think we can and should do quite quickly, which is a woman can go to a doctor, say how the bleeding and other symptoms, it's not only bleeding, it's pain, it's affecting their bowels, it's affecting their energy levels, it even affects their heart. Like we're seeing women now, we're understanding that you're at a higher risk of atrial fibrillation if you have fibroids. And it's like, actually, let's bring these two bits together. It's something where you've got a growth growing inside your uterus. But as I say, it causes a domino effect across the whole of the body. And it's not only in the reproductive space, and it's not only around when you have your period. It's potentially all day, every day in different ways. And so let's get to a place where we can understand that a woman is affected by her fibroids, diagnose those fibroids. It's very quick. We do an ultrasound. Yeah, we could do CT, MRI, we can do more fancy imaging, but by and large, the majority of fibroids can be diagnosed by ultrasound, and we can get as much information as we need. So tech really then comes in, because where we then get to is this very long trial and error. And we can all understand the science that goes behind it. We want to go with the least intervention, with the least side effects first, and work our way up. But what that does mean is that for many, many women, they have to go through a number of different treatment options before they get to the one that works for them. So I would really like to see that tech actually reduces that treatment time, and so that we get much better at really being able to kind of stratify different fibroids through the diagnosis point and say, oh, well, you've got this type of fibroid, or you've got this size, or this location of fibroid, or there's these other elements or symptoms that are being caused, that means that this, let's not worry about these, we should go straight to this. Exactly what we see in the kind of more oncology space, where we're saying, actually, we're looking at a number of different factors and we're giving a more, it's sort of semi-personalized, because it's not completely tailored to that person, but it's more stratified to say, well, you fit into this particular group, which is different to this group, and give treatment accordingly.
So when we think about health tech more generally, Michelle, in the context of women's health, is there anything that you think that we should be prioritizing at the moment, or that we potentially should be doing differently from your experience?
That's a bit of a question, isn't it? That's a bit of a meaty one. It's like literally would be the billion-dollar answer. I'm like, well, this is where you need to do your tech.
All the founders are listening out eagerly. chomping at the bit, ready to go for it.
I know, and I have lots of investors who come to me and say, "So, what area of women's health should we be investing in?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I'd take anyone right now, to be honest." But I think the thing for me is that I, I'm a very basic person at heart, and I look at things in a very simplified way. And I think we need to keep focused on the impact it's actually going to have to a woman. And I think we need to raise the bar of what we mean by impact. So, yeah, of course, I want women to be more informed and knowledgeable and feel more empowered. But that seems like quite a low level bar that we're aiming for. What I really want is that women live longer in better health. You know, being empowered isn't really going to really quite fill that gap between where we are now and where we want to be. And so I think that's just a given. What we're doing in tech so much in women's health is a given, and it should have been done a long time ago. And that's no disrespect to the people who are doing it, but it's just that we need to accelerate and aim a lot higher. And so I think, I think one thing that I always advise anybody that I'm working with is to say, stop looking at yourself as though you're in femtech, and I hate that term, but actually look at yourself as though you are in technology, in health tech, because the people over in biotech or doing anything in the oncology field are not talking about really, I've got $1 billion startup that's looking to empower patients around their cancer treatment. Like, no, they're talking about this is going to give an extra year of life, 5 years of life, or this will be able to pick up this particular thing earlier, etc., etc. I'd like to see that that's how we started talking about tech in women's health. And really looking at it the other way of, I say it's the healthcare of women, because women's health just gets narrowed down to reproductive health so often. So it's the healthcare of women. And what I would really say is that, being that basic clinician at heart, I would say any tech that helps us diagnose or treat, you know? And I read something really recently that I thought was particularly interesting, that we talk a lot about earlier diagnosis, earlier diagnosis. And the thing is, earlier diagnosis is only one part of the problem or solution. We need to be able to have a treatment. And whilst I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing things at earlier diagnosis, we need to be more joined up, I would say, and say, look, if you're doing this at earlier diagnosis, let's look at what's on the horizon for treatment options. Because while we can diagnose something, we actually want to be able to treat it. And so I think ultimately treatment will always win out. That will always be my number one, because that's actually going to have an impact. We're going to be looking at cure, or at least a significant improvement. But I recognize that with the treatment options available across healthcare today, you need to do diagnosis hand in hand, because so often the diagnosis is what's enabling you to treat, and the treatment is what's enabling you to diagnose. And I think that's really interesting. If you look at big pharma, the way that they've organized themselves, generally speaking, is they have a treatment arm and they have a diagnostic arm. And whichever one does something new, they will then pick up in the other arm and say, okay, if you've built this new treatment that's for this specific group of, let's say, breast cancer, I now need a diagnostic that will find that specific group of breast cancer. And I love that. That's a much more married up approach that makes sense. And that's going to have an impact.
The problem is, I imagine that treatment and diagnosis is not fast. It's not fast. It's not sexy. It's not going to sell. And I think that's part of the reason why there's not so much effort and so much excitement in these spaces. But we look at it as clinicians and we're like, but this is where the impact actually is. This is what we need to do. Exactly as you said. It's not all about getting lots of empowerment and selling lots of direct to consumer apps that people will pay for. It's actually about what happens further down the line. How do you diagnose? How do you treat? That's where the true impact is.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's not fast. And I think there's interesting innovation into how to speed it up. But I think ultimately it's never going to be a fast moving consumer good. But what I do think is that probably, Rome wasn't built in a day, and probably where we are now is necessary steps. And if we fast forward 10, 20 years and look back, will have seen we've gone through the steps that sometimes feel quite frustrating, but probably they were steps that we needed to do. So to kind of contradict everything I just said, I do see the role that we have in consumers, direct to consumer offerings, because that is building interest and kind of momentum in that space.
Yeah.
And more than anything, it builds pressure to say, wow,
Yes.
now we've got a stack load of data that tells us just how everyone's feeling, as
Yep.
in, clinically, socially, psychologically, we've got to do something
Yeah.
about that.
I feel the
And I think
same.
the weight of that information and data
Yeah. I
is
feel the
growing.
same. I feel the same. And it's also that fatigue. I keep saying to everybody, I have this tech fatigue. No, what I have is this direct to consumer, early stage in the pathway sort of fatigue. And I think this has been part of the process. We need to reach this point of fatigue to push us into, okay, now what do we do about it? What's the next step? And I do feel that is exactly where we are right now. We're on that cusp of turning all this, people are aware and we've empowered more people into what are the next steps now? Let's
Yeah.
move on. Yeah.
And I definitely see. So when I was in a startup back in 2020, I was at Vera Health. We were building a digital lifestyle behavior app to complement the perimenopause and beyond stage. So whether you're taking HRT or not, whether you're taking other medication or not, this was the lifestyle behavior change that would come together and complement it. And, that was, and continues to grow and be successful. But I think what's particularly important is at that time, which was only 6 years ago, felt very different to this time. And at that time, there was a real kind of windfall, like, let's go after getting investment was easier for digital apps in women's health than it is now. And I think that's because the investors have understood that any win is a quick, short term win. And the ability to win now, like there was some low lying fruit, that's all been picked. And now we need to look into something else. So it's like the next cycle starts. And I think when you look at it, investors I know are saying, what diagnostics have you got? What are good companies looking at diagnostic? What are good companies looking at devices? What are good companies looking at therapeutics? They've changed their thinking and they've realized that, okay, this isn't where we're at. We actually want to go to tangible assets that can be patented because that's where the value lies, because that's why you patented it, because it has an impact, because it's going to return an investment. And that's really where intellectual property lies.
Yeah, I think as well, like you say, we're spending a lot of time still talking about the problem. Even at event, we keep talking about the problem. We're getting the data to show that there are a problem, but we're spending less time talking about solutions and about
Mm,
innovation to drive forward that diagnosis and treatment. And really, it'd be great if we could see a few more events that are focusing a bit more on, instead of raising awareness and like you say, more of the empowerment angle, that collaboration between diagnosis, treatment, and really putting the accelerator on moving things forward.
mm, definitely. And I think that needs to go both ways. It needs to be, I mean, I absolutely love the women's health community. I think we're a wonderful group. It's global. It's got so much momentum. It's very unique community. Everybody is very familiar or knows each other very well and wants to help each other out. And I think that's wonderful. And that's perhaps part of why it's been so successful, despite it hasn't had always the massive kind of influx of money to follow the movement. But I think we need to kind of break down the barriers a little bit more and kind of spread our wings and start turning up with a new, diagnostic or treatment in a gynae cancer or in incontinence at biotech, oncology, other kind of disciplines within healthcare. And that's how we start to see the integration rather than being this separate piece, which I get that's where we started, but I think we need to kind of adapt and evolve.
We'll probably have a few people listening as well who are very inspired by your own experience as an advisor. So
Mm.
if you've just got maybe a couple of tips for people that are thinking about moving into that space, particularly, I suppose, for the clinicians listening, just as we're wrapping up?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I am a big, big proponent of bringing clinicians, and it doesn't have to be that they leave their clinical work. This can be done alongside, it can be done for a bit and then stopped and come back to, there's so many different ways to make it work. But I am a big believer in bringing that clinical insight and expertise. And the reason why I am is because it's it's like any speciality. It's an understanding of that speciality. It's not fully comprehensive, but it brings deep knowledge and insight that is needed alongside lots of others people's insights to actually enable a product or service to reach the market and be successful. What I think where it gets a little bit kind of murky, and this would be my tip, is that it is difficult. I've been there and I can definitely speak to it. It's very difficult to come out of a very clinical situation where, especially like if we look at obstetrics, it's very protocol driven, guideline driven. You've got massive kind of insurance claims going on. You've got a lot of risk there. And step out on a Friday afternoon and have a conversation with someone and advise them with regard to a startup. It's very hard to shift your mindset, but it's really important that as clinicians we do shift it, because what's happening is that I see that with a lot of clinicians, they want to get into it and they start, but it doesn't really progress. And I think that's because they're still looking at things as though they're sort of very much on that clinical space, and they're bringing everything that they've got into this very possibly much lower risk, usually is a much lower risk situation, and dealing with it in the same way. So I think if you do want to get into advisory work, there's a massive demand for it and people are really interested. But you've got to understand the other side of the coin, that if you're trying to build something and you've brought in an advisor and all they do is give you no and problems, that person's going to start to think, I'm not sure how helpful it is to bring this advisor on. And it's not
Yeah.
personal. And I've been in that situation. And it's like, it's very difficult, but you do have to change your mindset a little bit. It's not to say that you let things go. I don't let anything go. But what I do is I communicate the risk I'm worried about and I
Mhm.
communicate possible solutions, mitigations. And I say, this is what the worst case scenario is. This is the best case scenario. And I divide it up and I say the worst case scenario with regard to your business, the worst case scenario with regard to your user, the worst case scenario with regard to your brand, etc., etc., etc. So then you can be fully informed. And then that has actually become really good clinical advice. And that's really useful to have Michelle on board or other clinicians on board. But very often I will bring clinicians on board with me and they're just like, well, this is just a definite no. You're never going to be able to do this. And I was like, okay, let's not start with that
Yeah.
because that's not a great place to start. And people aren't going to really want this. So it's like trying to put yourself in another person's shoes. And it's very different for us because, when I think back to where I was, where I was 100% clinical, I couldn't imagine having that sort of creativity and innovation mindset. And I've had to work hard to build that inside myself. And now, because I've done it for a long time, I can switch between different scenarios very well. So if I'm dealing with a company that's looking to a direct to consumer product, it's more in a wellness space that's not looking to be regulated, I can switch to that also to something which is a prescribed therapeutic that will be run by doctors, which would be more very much the clinical setting as of olden days, as in from my previous career days. But, you've got to be able to switch and adapt to it.
Yeah, that's perfect, Michelle. That is the best way I've heard it put. Like that is
Thank
really
you.
like perfectly,
It's as though
perfectly
I've
put.
done it.
It's
Yeah,
so well
definitely.
summarized, but I think it's because you know what you're talking about. So that
Thank
explains
you.
why.
Yeah, and I definitely feel that, I can, like, I know, Emma, you're still working clinically, but all that reflective practice, that drove me nuts. And now I look back and I think, oh my God, I probably was just very immature and naive, and I didn't really understand the point of it, because all it was like, you've got a massive ring binder and you need to turn up with 10 reflective practices, and someone's not going to look at it and then go fine and give you some number for your ARCP that year. And it was just like, what the hell? Now, when I run my own business, I have to reflect, because I have to understand what's working, what's not working. And if I feel like, if I was to speak with medics today and really, be involved in what they need, it isn't have that mindset because you're going to end up leaving medicine and running a business. It's have that mindset because that's the mindset. Look at your practice and see what's working, what's not working. Understand what makes a difference. And even if you think on paper, logically, scientifically, this is what works, you can understand when you're looking at someone, okay, this is not, when I'm advising this client, this is not hitting. And why is it not hitting? Why are they not okay with this? And that's where being a clinician, the other magical skill we have is we have great soft skills. We can understand we can totally work out when someone is like, yeah, but no. And you'll never see them again. And you're like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, that is just absolutely sunk. And then you build that confidence to say, okay, that didn't hit with you. What's going on? What's the bother? And they're like, yeah, but we got told by somebody else that we're going to do it this way. And I'm like, okay, but this is why I'm worried about if you do it this way. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm just saying this is why I'm worried. This is what I've seen happen. But have some humility to realize you haven't seen everything. And also, I think you have to I massively had a steep learning curve in understanding that the way I did medicine as a clinician, where I just went to med school and I went into the hospital and I worked there, and that whole lifespan was 20 years, and that's all I knew. And I really understand that that was my world, and it was very, very limited. And as soon as you step out of that and you start to really understand that, what does that mean? Like, thinking about the health of women, what does that mean for that woman? Like, and when I started working in startups and you didn't see them, they didn't see you as a doctor, but they're like, you're running a pilot on WhatsApp and you're just like, text me anytime you want kind of thing. And then you really understand what they're going through 24/7. You realized how much you didn't know when you were a doctor and you saw them for 10, 15 minutes. And so be humble around, like, don't always think that what you know is right. It's not necessarily. It might be right from your perspective, but it's not necessary the perspective that actually that your client, that business is trying to go after.
I think
Thank
there's
you,
some
Michelle.
absolutely amazing advice there, Michelle. I think your wealth of experience has just absolutely shone through there. And like Claudia says, I don't think we've heard anyone put it so honestly, but also with some actionable and tangible steps that people can take as well. So thank you so, so much for that advice.
Oh, great.
Thank
If
you.
people want to follow you online, which I'm sure after all of those nuggets of information, they definitely will, where can they find you and where can they learn more about MFG Health?
Yeah, sure. So I have a website, MFG Health. You can just Google that and find it there, mfghealth.co.uk. And I'm also, like both of you, quite an avid poster on LinkedIn on all things related to health of women, what people are doing, what people aren't doing, what people should be doing. Definitely as a keyboard warrior. And yeah, so definitely, yeah, do follow along on LinkedIn. And then, yeah, my book is coming out in July. It's available for pre-order now, and it's, yeah, literally, as I said, nice and basic in a good way. It's all about kind of cutting down the barriers so that people understand. So the title does what it says on the tin: Fibroids, from symptoms to diagnosis and beyond. So catchy, and definitely, like, we get what we get, it tells us there. So yeah, please do take a look at that when it comes out in July.
Thank you so much for
Fabulous.
coming on, Michelle. It's been
Thank
absolutely
you.
delightful.
Thank you,
Thank
Michelle.
you
See
so
you
much. It's
outside
been a
number
laugh.
10 with my placard. I'll let you
Yes,
know when I'm going.
definitely.
She'll be there with a pineapple and a sellotape.
Not salad.
Plasticine.
I want cocktail sticks every time.
Thank you so much. See you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for being here. We love having you with us on this journey through women's health and innovation.
Follow us on Instagram at the Pink Pineapple Podcast for clips, conversations, and the latest in women's health and femtech.
We'll see you next week. Same pineapple, new topic. Everything we talk about on the Pink Pineapple Podcast is here to inform and inspire, but it's not a substitute for professional medical advice. If you're worried about your health, please reach out to your GP or healthcare provider.